Certainly a pleasure for me. Pleasure for me to be with you, and Ken, I'm so glad you were able to join us, because I was thinking about the origins of this book. Our grandparents' names on the land, Hashiko Has Ani Sahu, and really Ken was there at the very beginning, because when I was a student and thinking about place names, beginning to write about it, and hadn't even been to Alaska yet, I first came to work as an intern for the Alaska Department of Fish and Game Division of Subsistence. And one thing led to another. I worked in a couple of communities, Sitka and Angoon, but then the big opportunity to sort of do something with place names for a policy objective came in Glacier Bay with the Hoona Indian Association, and was kind of brokered by the Division of Subsistence. Then we were working with Bob Schroeder, and so Ken was part of that, and I was remembering that, and then he's kind of been a key person, particularly in the Hoona place name study, as things carried on, and even subsequent to the publishing of the map for Glacier Bay and then this book. He's continued to work with putting place names on the map with the community of Hoona to educate people who are going into Glacier Bay. So it's really wonderful that he's with us, because he's really been with this project since its very origins, and of course grew up speaking Tlingit and navigating by place names. So that's a little bit of an introduction to the origins of the book. And
right,
also,
and we should say today that we're talking with Dr. Tom Thornton from UAS, and also Ken Grant from Hoona, traditional knowledge teacher and expert. And Ken is on the phone, and Tom is here, and we're focusing on your book. And I am not good at Tlingit, and I'm trying to learn more. I'm going to take a language class this winter through the Chilkoot Indian Association to get better at it. So I apologize if I mangle things. So I'm going to ask you to just say the title of the book, or say it in the proper way, because that's what we're talking about here, proper words for the right things, right?
Well, I'll defer to Ken. He's the native speaker. So.
Well, I think Tom, you mentioned it. That was Yaha Anisako, Ashishko Hasani. The place names that our ancestors gave us and passed it on to us. And I'd like to add for the beginning that I think the timing was perfect for getting this place names. We were at, like, the Titanic is going down, our culture is really struggling. And getting the elders together to give the place names is very key to a lot of our knowledge that we're still gaining today. A lot of our stories, our Tlingit stories, had place names to it, and as we worked on this place name map, we were discovering the actual places that the elders were talking about in the traditional stories. And I think had this gone past a couple of years, we'd have lost most of the elders that were very key in providing information on the place name. So I really commend the team that put this thing together. Like you mentioned, the subsistence and the fish and game division, Bob Schroeder and Tom, and numerous elders that were very key for this book. So I wanted to mention that.
Thank you, Ken. And really, we're not really just talking about place names and going back to the indigenous names, but it's all connected. We're talking about a way of being because the names describe places that have a meaning to them culturally. Is that the correct interpretation of this, Tom?
Yeah, I
Yeah, I
mean,
think it's.
well, go ahead,
Yeah,
Ken.
go ahead.
Go ahead, Ken. Sorry.
Yeah, for my part, yeah, I mean, I approached place kind of from an anthropological perspective, which suggests that names for things are important. And so a name that's deposited on the land, if you will, is a kind of an artifact. You know, it tells something about the meaning of that place and what people did there and how it relates to other aspects of that landscape. But beyond that, you know, people develop a sense of place that is multi-sensory, and synesthetic is the word that is sometimes used. It's like combined senses. And the amazing thing about indigenous place names is the fact that they often do command all of those senses and give you that sense of being there because they're very descriptive and they capture that sensory experience. And the kind of opposite of that, and you see a lot of these names in Glacier Bay, which we were talking about earlier, is the kind of just biographical naming or honorific naming, where you're just putting someone's name on a place as a kind of a, you know, a marker or an honorific, and it doesn't really describe what's there. And of course, a lot of that went on in Alaska because people were kind of sailing by on an expedition, you know, for this or that state, and putting their names on the land. And fortunately, we have some exceptions to that. People who actually got down and were guided by Tlinkits and other peoples as they were, quote unquote, discovering the land. Of course, they weren't discovering it for the first time. But in those cases, we have some better documentation in the historical record of those names, and also of their context. But the full context really comes from the people who named places. And in Tlingit country, that means, you know, the clans that held those territories. They're the ones who are in the best position to interpret those names and give the context and the meaning. And so that's the way we went about this project, was working with federally recognized tribes. And my partner in that process was Harold Martin, who unfortunately is no longer with us, but was very attentive to that process. And I think that really made it work smoothly, because, you know, he went to the tribes, asked permission to do the project, and then we worked with the people they suggested we work with, which was typically clan leaders and clan elders, and then we recorded and worked to get a proper mapping and transcription and meaning for those places.
And Ken, when you were working with this project, I'm assuming, and how, I'm trying to figure out like how much of even the names, because they do contain sort of proprietal information, maybe about a good place to fish, or a place to get berries, or a good launching site to put a boat in out of the water. I mean, was there a concern about telling too much about what the old places meant and where they were, or is that not part of the discussion?
Yeah, I think you hit it on the head there. There was a possessiveness for territories that clans occupied, and the clans gave the names. And in our culture, we call it Pasatawahane. Pasatawahane means they have ownership to the name and the place. And if it's a good berry picking place like Dundas Bay, that was owned by several clans, but primarily the Daksinton. And Glacier Bay had names that belonged to different clans, like the Chukanini, that belonged to the Chukanini clan, and also the Patini belonged to Kaguantan. So a place like here in near Huna, Sakwai, Duck Point translates, but what it really means, the point that belongs to the ducks. And that was one of the things about the naming the places. A lot of the names gave spirituality to the place. Kakoi belonged, and Kakhini, the stream that belongs to the Sakai, and Tukanhini, the stream that belongs to the river grass. We gave credit to the plants that were there or the fish that were there. There was spirituality connection there, but not all of it was either. Some of them were descriptive, like Yai Shaku, Yai Shaku, a little whale. It's a description of the formation of the land. Glacier Bay itself tells the history of what went on there. Shui was the first name of it. And we don't know how many years. We always like to use the phrase 10,000, but anyway, since time immemorial, Shui, land at the glacial edge, was where our people lived there. They had villages there, and as time went on, when the glacier came down and created the bay that we know now, it became what was the name of it? Sitkipipi. Sitkipipi was the bay in place of the glacier when the glacier came down and formed the bay. And as time went on, people returned to hunt there. And there was icebergs all over the place there. And I was privileged to live through the tail end of it, of seeing the large icebergs coming down from the bay. And as young people, we described them as large as cruise ships. They were very large, and then it became Atitu. Atitu is another descriptive name of Glacier Bay. Among the icebergs, that's where people went together to seal and halibut and other edible foods, that mountain goats that were occupying the mountains. So, but it's very good to have history of Glacier Bay just by the names.
I know in reading Tom's book, there was it was interesting. It was the note that, like you were just describing for me as an English speaker, the idea that the names are actually a verb. The place where the ice was, or where the icebergs come in, like it's moving and changing all the time. And I'm wondering if when you were gathering the names and deciding which ones to use, if names had changed over time because the places had changed, or the vegetation had changed, or a particular pool that you fished in had changed. If there's also, a reason just to know the names sort of for the historical change in climate and topography.
I don't believe there was any question as to which name to use. Pretty obvious that when the ancestors of the Huna Tlingit were living there. They were living at the edge of the glacier and the glacial silt. I mean, there was no question. And then when the glacier came down and created the bay, there was no question that it was a bay. And it never was a bay before. So, no, there was no problem in it. They're highly descriptive, and I think it describes the geology of the place just by the naming of it. And also hot too. Amongst the glaciers, people went up there seal hunting and fishing and whatever food they can gather from the shoreline and the mountains. No, there was no question.
I think there's something else there, which is I found fascinating, is that in Tlingit, there's a retaining of multiple names for a single place. So they kind of recognize the historical depth of connection over time. And so in a dynamic area like Glacier Bay, where the glacier has advanced and retreated, all of that is marked. And of course, that speaks to, like an artifact, it speaks to the antiquity of people in that place. And that's been helpful actually in reconstructing the geologic history of that area. So place names are really kind of underutilized, and they're undervalued as a source of evidence for those kinds of connections. Another connection you see is, and this one I think turned out to be very important in Glacier Bay, which is where we've been speaking, is there was a guidebook written in the 60s, I think put out by the Sierra Club, and it kind of bemoaned the fact that there were only 4 Tlingit place names left on the map. One of them, which Ken referenced, is, I think it's called Setakaday Narrows in English, but that's because John Muir wrote it that way. And it's really this Sit Iti Gei, this bay taking the place of the glacier. And he translated it as Glacier Bay, which is kind of the way you might do it in English, because we don't really have place names like bay taking the place of the glacier. We don't have that sort of activity embedded in a place name, or it's not so easy to do. But it turned out when we went and we interviewed and we asked people, and Ken said we probably did this really right on the edge of when we could recover a lot of it, because a lot of native language mother tongue speakers were dying. We had close to 200 just within the park itself, not 4, but close to 200, and some of them are quite dense. And wherever you have a density of indigenous names, what I like to sometimes call a hotspot, usually that's very significant, because it points to obviously a very favorable place, high level of biodiversity, productivity, and so on. And those are places that many of them still have importance for those ecosystem values, if you will, as well as their cultural values. And so not having those names on the map, that becomes invisible, and we're missing some of this wisdom that's actually been marked by the indigenous people of this area. And that's true in other areas as well. But and a lot of it is offshore. It's in the nearshore environment. It's not strictly on land. So that's something else that I've come to really appreciate about Tlingit names. And you don't find that pattern in all indigenous people. Some will abandon a name and place a new one on it. But in Tlingit, they tend to keep the old ones in historical memory. And maybe I'll add something about the difficulty, though, about that, is that the memory is connected with clan histories. And so one of the things you face when you're trying to document place names is that it's a kind of a more rarefied subset of vocabulary, and not everyone has it. So you can ask, most Tlingit people, what do you call a killer whale? And you can get an answer, but you can't ask them all, what do you call the point above Haynes or something like that. That's going to be a much smaller subset of people that really know that lexicon, that set of place names. And so that made the work even more challenging. But what was interesting is that when we would go into communities, people would refer us to those people who had those ties, and that was very important. And the first community I ever entered was Angoon to ask questions about a fishery in Sitco Bay, and I was pointed towards this older woman at the senior center luncheon, which was always the best place to go to start a conversation about place name. And she said, well, come to the house after lunch. And she met me at the door, and she pulled out a button blanket. And she said, these are what our place names are about in Sitco Bay. And she showed me how the designs on the blanket, this was a Deshitan Raven Clan blanket, how they referenced specific places in Glacier Bay, or excuse me, in Sitco Bay, including Sitco Creek, which is another Gatini, a red salmon creek, a place called Yeshkatuku, Raven's Cave, and a very important little spring called Tinaguni, named for the copper shield. And so, you could think of that blanket very much like a deed of trust, a historical document about how this group has possession. And then you think about how people wear that regalia, in ceremonies, and they literally are embodying their own geography. And I think that contributes not only to people's sense of place and identity, but also to their memory, and the fact that you do have very strong memories of place and place names in Tlingit country. And so even working in the late 20th and early 21st century, trying to record these things, we were able to get quite a lot because of the way memory is held in this oral culture.
What's interesting in the Haynes area, or Deshu, as it's properly called, is, for me, going through your book as a Westerner, lived here 30, 40 years or whatever, it was almost like the opposite. The names that we know that are used every day, there's not that many, Chilkoot, Lutak, that area. But then in here, when you see talking about like the significance, there's at least there's a dozen place names within a mile of the mouth of the Chilkoot River and the lake that all have really strong significance and mean something. And they just realized how well used that corridor was, going up into the inlet and the whole Portage Cove crossing and around and up from Deshu, and even along the lake itself, many different names where we just say, oh, it's Chilkoot Lake. On the other end is the Glory Hole, but different points, different hills, and it's and it also points to the way people traveled, because I live on the lower Chilkat side of Haynes, and so I was thinking, oh, what are all the names here? Well, really, once Yendestucky, once you're about there, anything south of that isn't much, because you portaged across and went the other way. And that now is where the high school is. And you don't realize even the western name, Portage Cove, why was it called that? Because people were lining boats through, and that's the way you went to the Chilkoot. And that was just the corridor. And I was just fascinated by that, and how it seems like even that's not as well known in the community as I'd like it to be. And I think for me that's the value of this, like getting back to some of those place names and really what they are and what they mean, and how we use those places, and how much they were used forever and still are. But I don't know if Ken, if you had sort of any of those same kind of things happen in Huna with the revitalization of some of the names and people realizing that there's more to it than just the common names of the places that you use or not.
Well, there are a lot of places, that are history. While you were talking, I was thinking of Willie Ross gave a story on the exit from Glacier Bay, the Coglantons, the Chukanadis, and the Wishkitons. They exited, and for some reason, they settled in different places. And Willie Ross talks about I think it was the Chukanadis that came to what is now Port Frederick. And something that is not very well known about or written about is our people sacrificed slaves to make it official, and the bay was a slave was put in the water, and his name was, oh my gosh, it slipped my mind now. Give me a second. You can edit this out. Well, anyway, the slave name was given to the name of this bay. And stories told about the killer whale down in, I think it's around Cape. And this guy had the idea of making a killer whale. And he tried different woods like hemlock, spruce, alder, but the killer whale wouldn't respond to it. And we finally tried cedar, and the killer whale came to life. And there's a long story that goes with this. The young couple got married, and they went up a bay there in Cape. Maybe you know the story, Tom. Anyways, the killer whale said, let's go up the bay there. There's a lot of food there. There's seals and halibut. So they went up the bay, and then this young couple just got married. They wanted to go up the bay, and no one knew at the time that the killer whales can transform into humans. Some of our good stories are like that. They're supernatural. The killer whales, as they approached the shore, turned into humans, and they went up and made camp. And this young couple came up in their canoe, and they were looking for a place to camp, and they saw this camp, the killer whale camp, and they said, "Oh, let's go and join them. Maybe we can eat together." And they went ashore. As they were going ashore, the man jumps into the water and promptly starts to urinate into the water. And for somehow this offended the killer whale people. And they all went running down to the water and jumped into the water, transformed back into killer whales. And they went down bay. And the young couple went up to where the killer whales were camping, and they saw all this good food, and they said, "Oh, let's get some to eat here." They left a lot of food. And while they were getting ready, they saw this thing coming on the water. It looked like a canoe. They said, "Oh, look, a canoe is coming. Let's wait for them." And as it approached, it became apparent that it was actually a young killer whale, that all the killer whales are underneath, holding it up like a canoe and coming to them. And the killer whales transformed back to humans. They went up and they captured the wife and proceeded to take her down bay. And the husband tried to follow him. He jumped in his canoe. This is a long story. He jumped in his canoe and paddled down, following the killer whales that were taking his wife as hostage. And as he went down the bay, he came to a place where there's cliffs. And those of us that are familiar with our land, where this cliffs is usually the deep waters outside of it, and the killer whale sound is there. And the husband beached his canoe and climbed to the top of the cliff, and he wrapped rocks around his waist, and he jumped overboard from the top of the cliff there. And as he was going down, it became like he was on land. He saw this community, this village, and he could breathe. He was like he was on land. And he went to the first house, and he asked the person in there who was the killer whale chief. He asked if he had seen a woman that was his wife, and the chief said no, but the village across from us here is Wishkitan. We heard that they captured a woman, and he took her as his wife. And so he went over there. As he was going, there was somebody watching him. He could feel somebody watching him. And he looked in, and there was somebody peeking from behind a tree. And he approached this being, and this being said, "Do you know who I am?" And he said, "No. Remember a few years ago you lost your halibut hook?" And said, "I'm that halibut hook that you lost. And I'm a slave for the people, the shark people, Ushkitan people." And he asked him, "Did you see a woman that they might have captured?" And he said, "Yes, I saw it." And this story does have meaning to it. The halibut hook person said, "I can help you." They send me up after water in the evening, and when I come into the house, I'll dump the water over the fire, and when the steam comes out, you can go and capture your wife. And that's what happened. He captured his wife. And that story probably continues, but I'll continue with the killer whales. Said they got together and said, "There's a place up north. It's called, I'm trying to think of that name yet. And we heard that there's a lot of food up in there. And this happened to be in the bay that we occupy now as Huna. And we said, okay, let's go. And the killer whales came up, and they started up bay here. And when they got up bay, they transformed into humans again. And they made camp there. And then early next morning, the killer whales proceeded to the portage. We call it the portage lagoon. And they sure enough, they knocked a hole through that portage. And we still have that portage today. And we still have cross timbers that go over that portage where people can drag their canoes over it. And I'm trying to think of that name. For some reason, it escapes me. Really important part of the name.
You mean the portage between Teneke and Port Frederick? Yeah. Okay. Keet Guni. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, Keet Guni.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the thing about this, it's told by Willie Ross about the slave. And then the story goes all the way down to Cake. And they said there's a place up here that's the same name of that slave. So the two stories connect.
Wow. No, I never heard that version. I just heard about the portage, but not the whole story behind it. That's wonderful.
Well, I was sad because my grandmother told me that story. and she passed away. And then I was going to ask my mother about that story, and she passed away. And just doing my work at the Park Service and reading different translations, I came across this connection, which to me is really, really wow. You know, how can this happen? Different villages with a story that connects.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I mean, that's the kind of context you get that connects places too, you know, that
Yeah.
they're often tied to stories. And the one that really blew me away is the one you have, and I know you know this story, Ken, about the salmon boy, but the version in Sitka is just so detailed about how the salmon come into the place they call Tachet, Naquasina, Naquasina Sound, and they mention all of the places that they go by and how they're affected by the currents and how they see the smokehouses from underwater. And so this whole story is just, it sounds fantastical, but it's embedded actually in the geography of Sitka, and it kind of tells you how salmon come into these rivers above Sitka, and also their perspective of humans from, you know, as they're coming in, which is really incredible if you're, you know, trying to please and cultivate these fish so that they will return year after year. So
yeah. Well, there are a lot of stories that have a lot of meaning, but we'll go into the night on those ones.
Yeah, and I know, I mean, an area when we did the documentation of Glacier Bay that was really interesting to me was the outer coast, and that's you know, that's Ken's clan territory. But I don't know if you can want to talk about any of them, because maybe it gets deep. But the one Ganaha, I thought was so interesting because you know, it's such an important landmark when you're navigating out there on the outer coast. And the Duckdainton have a whole, you know, story and the Kittiwake and all the symbology and calls that go along with it. So I mean, to me, that's a really good illustration of sense of place.
Yeah, it is. It's part of our story. We use it. We use the story in a time of grief and a time of celebration. Kittiwake plays a really important part on our culture, even today, right now, as we speak. Kittiwake is very, very important to all of Huna, all the eagles. It's a healing thing when they hear the Kittiwake crying. It's crying for sadness, but it also does it for joy. After we have the grieving part of our ceremonies, and we do the breakaway, and we do a real lively song. And if we're the host, we do the Kittiwake cry, and it really lifts the spirits of the eagle clan. Really, anyway, it's out there on the outer coast. We call it Ganaha, and I've read the translations and have my own version of it. And I think it was translated by Herman Itka's Moko. But to me, it didn't fit because it goes sideways. It's an art. And to me, Ganaha is the outer coast. That's the way I translate it, the outer coast. Ganaha hits the outer coast house. That's the way I translate it. Another translation which it took a while to evolve in my way of thinking, was Eosha Shakion.
Mm-hmm.
It's just translated loosely as village on top of sand mountains, But my way of thinking, our people were pretty intelligent people. They wouldn't put it up on top where the wind is strong, and the outfall winds from the glacier would be a really big problem. But we when we use the word on, it means village. It also means territory, like eggland.
Mm-hmm.
Mountain goat land.
Mm-hmm.
General
Ani.
Yeah. Well, the way I translate that, Shakian is the land of the mountaintops. I mean, village by the mountaintops. Sand dune.
Mm-hmm.
It just makes more sense to me.
Yeah, and
I've introduced it at the park, and I don't know where it's going to go. But I just don't see our people building villages on top of sand dunes. Too much wind, glacier winds.
Yeah, and you raise a good point. It's really hard to translate sometimes these names, because if you do it just literally, it doesn't really make good sense in English, or it doesn't flow. But also, in many cases, they're compacted, and so there's other elements in there that don't necessarily appear in certain pronunciations of the name. So it happens in English place names. It certainly happens in Tlingit as well.
One of the names, sorry, go ahead, Ken.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that one of the names in Haynes, and I don't know if I can pronounce the Tlingit right way, but it's called it's in the book Katwaltu. Forgive me for my
yeah.
But it's a rock slide or place where the landslide comes down, and that's at 19 Mile, and we've spent millions of dollars building a road now to try to get around that, and it's almost, the name was so descriptive, and when I read it, I just had to laugh, because I thought, well, why would anybody build a road there if they knew that was what was going to be happening? And it's, I don't think any construction is going to stop a mountain from going to the sea. And it was an example to me of the value of if that had been the name that we knew it as, it might have altered some of the way we developed the area.
Yeah, and as I recall, I think that name was placed there partly because of a kind of natural disaster that occurred to a settlement there. So it kind of marks that as a memorial, but also not to build there again, at least as a habitation site or a road.
But again, here's a question maybe for both of you. Like, I'm interested in trying to figure out a way to where these names become part of the everyday speech, where we know them, and to bring those back. How difficult is that to do, or is that something that's even something that Ken, that is something that people want to have happen, or there's again some proprietary thoughts about those places that maybe we don't want to call attention to them and tell everybody where they are?
Yeah, part of our oratory, we don't talk about ourselves. We don't say my land.
Mm-hmm.
Each class on your grandparents' country. You call on your uncle's land. And that's the beauty of our culture is we don't talk about ourselves. We always give credit to the opposite clan. Like Glacier Bay, when I talk to Canadians,
Mm.
my mother's grandparents. It makes me happy now to look amongst you. We keep that I word out of our oratory. Although nowadays a lot of it coming back into our young people. And good information, Tom.
Mm.
But following up on your question, yeah, we do recognize, we talk about different lands. Like I talk about the Tuya Ishwasani, your father's people's land. I always give credit to the opposites, and that's the way the Tlingit culture is.
Tom talks about in working on this project and the names in general, the idea of what are the three R's: the resilience, the reliance, and respect. Can you expand on that a little bit? Resonance. Yeah, thank you.
I like reliance too. Maybe it should
reliance. I thought resonance and reliance were sort of the same thing, right? I don't know that it resonates. You rely on it. Maybe make them four, but no, I wouldn't. You're the expert. But if you want to maybe expand on that a little, or you two think about that some.
Yeah, well, I mean, in writing that, I was sort of thinking about why they have endured and why they should endure. And it seems like the three R's speak to that in a kind of simple enough way. That names are resilient, and the fact that even though there are not so many Tlingit language first speakers when we did this project, there was still some very good memory of names, and they had a certain resilience because people grew up with them. That was often the phrase we heard. I grew up hearing these names, and the example I always use about this is Harold Martin, who was traveling with me and really facilitated this project when he was at Tlingit and Haida, and he did I call it a big game of lowering my expectations for what we were going to get in cake. And he talked about Cake Day, where they nailed their culture shut in the coffin and all of this, and people gave it up. And of course, it's fortunate that culture is more resilient than that. You can't just symbolically give it up. It stays with you because it's your everyday life. And when we went to the lunch table at the senior center to talk about this, people started talking about names, and I noticed Harold's finger was going to the right places on the map. And maybe 30 names or so were mentioned, and he had pointed them all out. And I said, I thought you told me that nobody remembered these things, including yourself. And he said, well, of course I remember them. I grew up with them. And then he started to, the resonance part, the resilience being that they were still there. Maybe he couldn't call them up on his own, but when he heard them, they were there. And then he could begin talking about them. And because he fished in a lot of those places, and so when you're fish, that's a kind of engagement that's very attentive to landscape and seascape. And so, to the extent those names are descriptive and mark those kinds of phenomena, they do have a resonance. And of course they do, because your ancestors used the same places. And then, finally, respect. I think respect is about recognizing that a lot of names aren't on the map because they've undergone a kind of cultural erasure because of colonialism, because of the way maps are made. And now we talk quite openly about land acknowledgement and doing land acknowledgements, but what better way to acknowledge land than to use the indigenous name? So to me, that's part of the respect, and I see that happening in Juneau. especially where anytime a new building, a new road, a new facility, school, or so forth is conceived, they're turning to indigenous names first, and a lot of times those indigenous names are drawn from the geography. So Zentekahini Middle School was maybe the first one, and then others have followed. So I think that's part of what it means for me. I'm sure Ken can expand on that, though, for sure.
Yeah, I advocate for replacing a lot of the Euro-American names with the Tlingit names, especially in Glacier Bay. You know, there's some glaciers with people that we don't know anything about, and we have Tlingit names for the place. You know, but if I had another life, I think I'd be on the forefront of changing the names to the Tlingit names. But there's some young people that plant the seed for it, you know. Like Johns Hopkins, I don't think he's ever been there.
No.
Yeah, just on the day. Yeah.
Oh yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah.
How do you translate that one? That's such a good name.
Yeah, where the glacier broke through towards Mount Fairweather.
Mm-hmm. So that's a really good example of a kind of verb name. It's really speaking to the activity of the land in motion.
Yep. This plane was Pacific. It was a big mountain. I mean, the glacier that came down and formed the bay.
Mm-hmm.
Well, even Chukanhini, a real good name for Berg Bay.
Well, maybe our discussion will prompt some thoughts about that, and maybe some other communities to start going back to the names that have a meaning beyond a name. I mean, look at Haynes. I mean, we were named for the Secretary of the Presbyterian Home Missions, Mrs. Haynes. And she never even visited here. She's never even been here. We can't even say that there's any, I mean, Juneau, at least Joe Juneau was there. There's nobody that could say that there's a connection with the Haynes family or any kind of tie-in. So it would be nice to be Daishu again, but that becomes, as you know, it's a interesting reaction that some of those discussions bring, and it's not always the ones that you expect to be for and against those things. It involves a lot of respectful conversations, I think.
And there's a process for adding and changing names through the U.S. Board of Geographic Names, and that has been utilized for indigenous names in Alaska. And initially there was a lot of resistance because you've got specialized characters and people were concerned about mispronouncing things and so on. But I think then it was pointed out, you know, we have a lot of multisyllabic Russian names and other things that are also hard to pronounce, and people just don't pronounce them, you know, or they have their nicknames for them. So that kind of dropped away, and they can now handle diacritics and accents and things like that as part of the official spellings. And they can also do, I think if there's support, batch. You know, you don't have to do each name one by one, but you can do batch additions of names. But it's always been harder to replace a name, you know, witness McKinley Denali, than to add a name where there isn't one. So, but even in the case of Denali, they've kind of figured out how to do it ultimately. So
we've been talking for like an hour, a little over, and I don't want to keep either of you any longer. But I really appreciate the discussion, and I feel like we've just kind of started. So maybe we'll get to do it again so that maybe we can get some of these names back where they ought to be in this lifetime for you, Ken. And thank you, Tom. And I just want to say on behalf of the Alaska Center for the Book's Native Heritage Month celebration, thank you. Thank you both for taking the time to share this knowledge and for your grace and wisdom. And maybe Ken, how do we say goodbye in Tlingit so I can say it? You say
there's
goodbye.
There's no goodbye. What people have been saying is kosatinsu, but I changed it to which kosatinsu. Kosatinsu means I will see you again. But you could be lying in state, it passed on to the spirit world. I will see you. But when you say which means we will both see each other again. So which kosatinsu.
Oh, that's good.
I like that. Thank you. And I hope we see each other again in this world too.
Yep.
All right. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
All
thank
right.
you very much for the invitation.
Okay. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.